Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Venerable Sangha, Venerable lay disciples, I thank you for inviting me here today and giving me the opportunity to speak on Dhamma. This is my first time in Korea, and I've been here just 3 or 4 days now. So I'm learning a lot about the Korean culture and the Korean Buddhist tradition. So I'm finding it very interesting and very useful. And you'll have to forgive me if during my Dharma talk I say things that might sound different to the way you have understood Buddha Dharma in your tradition. I ordained in the Thai forest tradition in England, and even though the essence of Buddha Dharma is the same across all countries and cultures where Buddha Dharma is taught, sometimes the way of practice, the different emphasis on certain teachings, become quite different in cultures that have been separated from each other, particularly for many centuries. So we have, one could say, many different kinds of Buddhism these days. Tibetan Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Korean, Vietnamese, Burmese, Sri Lankan, Thai, and even lay Western Vipassana movements. So we have many different kinds of Buddhism. But really, you can't have many different kinds of Buddhism. Buddhism, just the basis of the Buddha's teaching, if it's really the essence of Buddhism, it will always come back down to that truth. The essence of Buddhism rests on the very truth that the Buddha discovered himself on the night of his enlightenment and taught from. His teachings were enlightened teachings. He taught from that place of enlightenment. And so even though we may, in these different generations, different cultures, have different forms of practice, the essence must truly be the same if we're to call it real Buddha Dhamma. And it's interesting today, as the world is becoming smaller, becoming more like a global village, that all these different traditions are coming together in the same cultures, or having conferences and meeting and talking about Buddha Dhamma. And we learn that there's many different ways of saying the same things. And yet you find that even within one's own tradition, the different teachers' realizations, they've realized the same things, but they might use different words to talk about that same thing or to point to that same thing. So this is an important thing to remember, that the words we use, in fact even the words the Buddha used to teach about truth, about Dhamma, were just skillful means, employed as skillful means to help people realize truth in their own hearts. Because words are changeable, they're so dependent on culture and social circumstances, and even in our own generation, a word that may have meant one thing when I was younger might mean something rather different now if I use it in a particular context. So words are changing their meaning all the time. But one quality of the truth that the Buddha pointed to is that it is unchanging. So when we're teaching Buddha Dhamma in different cultures to different beings who are caught in different kinds of predicaments, we might use different words, we might use different means, but they're pointing, essentially those means, those skillful means, should be pointing to the truth for individuals to realize, to taste in their own hearts. And then one will know directly the essence of Buddha Dhamma. And this is important just to recollect Just like the famous simile of the finger pointing to the moon. When we want to see the moon, when we want to know the moon, it needs a finger to point where it is, and then it directs our attention to the moon. But if we get stuck on the finger, then we're really stuck. You know, we don't know the moon, we don't see the moon, but maybe we start bowing to the finger, thinking this is the most important thing, the signpost to the moon, because we've been told the moon is the most important thing. But that's not it at all. In this case, the Dhamma is the most important thing. So the words we hear, the practices we do, if they lead us to tasting the truth for ourselves, then this is a good, skillful means. One of my favorite little sayings of the Buddha is, he says, just as the ocean has but one taste, that is the taste of salt, so this Dharma and discipline has but one taste, the taste of freedom. So this is perhaps a little criterion we can use for ourselves along the path of practice, according to how we're practicing and the results of those practices. Are they leading us to that taste of freedom? Something that we can taste and know for ourselves is freeing us from greed, hatred, and delusion, the suffering as a consequence that comes from not being awake, from not knowing the truth. Is it freeing us, truly? Because in many ways we can search for freedom. In fact, in my generation, freedom was the ultimate, born in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Freedom was such an important concept and an inspirational idea. And as many of you know, we searched for freedom in many ways, in the sensual realm, in the financial realm, in the material realm, breaking down the boundaries that have been set up for us by culture, by education, and ways of thinking that we've been taught. I was certainly a person who loved to break down boundaries because I wanted to experience freedom. I didn't want to be told what I should do. I wanted to know for myself. And in one sense, this is, I look back on those times in my own life as actually that was the noble search within me, trying to find freedom, but it didn't quite know where to look, so it would just break down willy-nilly any boundaries. Later on, I realized I didn't understand the law of karma, which is very helpful to comprehend, because when we break down boundaries without really understanding what boundaries are for and how they can actually be helpful, whether they're helpful or detrimental, then we can do ourselves damage and we can do other people's damage unwillingly, unknowingly, and this is unfortunate. But what the heart bent on truth is really longing for is the freedom from suffering that the Buddha promised. The freedom from suffering as he articulated it in birth, old age, sickness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. So that this way of articulating that realm of suffering was very focused on this human predicament, how it feels that there's a lot of pain in this life, and most of us don't have much understanding. And before the technological age, it actually, to just survive, took a lot of work, a lot of blood, sweat and tears just to have enough food to feed the family, just to battle with the weather conditions, all of these things. It made life quite difficult. And these days we can get a little bit disconnected from that truth of the suffering of birth, old age, sickness and death because of all our high-tech advancements, which are very useful, very helpful. But if we're not able to reflect on the truths of old age, sickness and death, then we're inhibiting ourselves from finding the freedom of the Buddha. When he, as an unenlightened Bodhisattva, was searching for the truth, these were the very truths that woke him up, that began to awaken wisdom in him, As many of you know, he was a prince in the northern part of India, and as such led a very privileged life. And he, when he talked of his own life, looking back, he said, I tasted everything of the sensual realm. I knew completely the gratification of the sensual realm. And yet, when he woke up to the truths of old age, sickness, death, something in him could no longer enjoy the pleasures of the sense realm. Something in him realized this is the fate of this being too. And then the questions started to arise. Well, is there anything more than this? Is it all just about eat, drink, and be merry, and then just pass away? And for him, these questions became quite powerful. He could no longer rest. And in the stories we hear of the Buddha's life at this stage, these signs that are called Devaduttas, the signs of old age, sickness, death, and the sign of a samana, a wanderer, a religious wanderer, one in search of truth. These are called Devaduttas. And Devadutta means heavenly messenger, a heavenly messenger. And as the story goes, these heavenly messengers were actually appearing to the Buddha in order to facilitate his waking up to truth. Because it takes that disillusionment with the pleasure we can gain on the sense realm, at the sense level, for us to begin to put in effort and inquire into where can we find freedom that is more lasting, more true, more real, more deep. Because we've all tasted the gratification on the level of sense pleasure, and it is lovely and intoxicating and enjoyable, and we go there again and again. But the fact that we go there again and again becomes suffering for us because we've developed a habit and an addiction to get our pleasure from these short-lived experiences. And the Buddha pointed to this as actually being the dukkha of attachment to the sense realm, as even though it is pleasurable in one aspect, actually it creates a much deeper underlying displeasure in that these pleasurable experiences end, they change, and that is beyond our control. But also that they create a dependency. If we have no other source for experiencing ease and pleasure, then these things outside of ourselves become a dependency and we get hooked. And we take birth in them again and again. And this experience is suffering. This is one aspect of suffering that the Buddha was pointing to that we have to understand. So anyway, when these Devaduttas appeared to him one after the other, he actually saw, as is said in the legend, saw for the first time an old person. Which seems strange to us because we see old people all the time, but it's said that the Bodhisattva's father knew that his son was a special being, and it was predicted that he would either become a Buddha, a fully enlightened Buddha, that is, leave the home life, leave the palace, and become a religious teacher and a fully enlightened Buddha, or he would become if he didn't do that, he'd become a world-ruling monarch. And his father, of course, wanted him to continue, inherit the kingdom from him and continue the ruling of the kingdom. So his father was desperate not to allow any religious inklings to arise in his son's life. So it is said that his father actually, when the son went out from the palace, he had everyone remove, the old people, the aged people, the sick people, and any corpses that were around, so his son was not touched by these things. Now that's the legend. But actually I see it in a slightly different light. That may be so, if he could control the realm in that way. But it may be something else, because just as in our experience around us, we see old people, we see sick people, And we know people who've died, and perhaps we've even seen their bodies. We see dead people on television. But has old age, sickness and death really woken us up yet? Has it really touched our hearts in a way that we recognize, oh, this being too is subject to old age, sickness and death? And even if we think, oh yes, I know I'm aging, I know I will die someday, I know I will get sick. When it happens to you, it hits you like a brick wall, like running into a brick wall, because you haven't really opened up to that truth yet. When a loved one suddenly dies, perhaps we've experienced that, the kind of trauma and grief and that arises, being bereft. We haven't really understood this truth of old age, sickness and death, that it's unavoidable in this realm. Now, instead of seeing these truths as a disaster, the Buddha actually started to teach that this was a way out. First, we have to see the truth, allow it to awaken in us our longing for freedom from that limitation, for freedom from the suffering involved in this realm, and the consequent suffering, and the psychological suffering, the emotional suffering, the confusion of not knowing who we are, why we were born, where we're going, and how to find peace and ease. This is all part of the teaching of dukkha. The Buddha used, because in his own experience, the seeing of the old person, the sick person, the dead person, and the religious seeker opened his eyes. And he said at first he felt something like humility, or almost, it sometimes gets translated as humiliation. I too will age. I too will become decrepit and decay. I too will die. It cut against the conceit of youth, against the conceit of thinking life is permanent, against the conceit of wealth, in that when you've got enough money you can do anything you want, but it doesn't buy you freedom from old age, sickness and death. It cut against those conceits and he became humbled. Important point. And he was then able to contemplate, what am I going to do about it? Is there a way out? Is there something more than this? And the sign, the fourth Devadutta, was a samana, a religious mendicant, a wanderer. And when the Buddha saw this sign, something in him felt cooled and relieved. Seeing this samana with a peaceful countenance, he understood there is a way out, and there are beings who are searching and practicing to understand that. And so that gave him then his own inspiration towards what he would do with his life. He could no longer enjoy the palace life, and so he decided to renounce his life in the palace and undertook the life of a wandering mendicant in search of the truth, in search of the deathless. This is how he phrased it in those days, in search of the unborn, the unaging, the undying, the deathless, the sorrowless, freedom from suffering, taintless, freedom from suffering. So here he's identifying, there is this, there is the deathless. It is possible to realize that which allows us freedom from the death-bound, freedom from the limited, freedom from the suffering realm we find ourselves in. And another way he articulated that, he said, there is the unborn, the unoriginated, the uncreated, the unformed. If it weren't for this, there would be no escape from the born, the originated, the created, the formed. But since there is this unborn, unoriginated, uncreated, unformed, there is an escape from the born, the originated, the created, the formed. So this forms a basis of his teaching. Now, to me, when I hear the word deathless, that resonates to me with exactly the same feeling as freedom when I was a young person searching for freedom, wanting freedom, as when I heard the teachings about the deathless reality. That it was the same resonance. Yes, that is the kind of freedom that I'm searching for, a freedom that transcends all boundaries, that a freedom that undermines all movements of greed, hatred, and delusion. A freedom once tasted, cannot be destroyed, cannot be turned around. And the Buddha referred to this deathless element or nibbana as the supreme security from bondage. Looking at this life as we live it as bondage. And I must say that is something that I experienced as a young person, even though I grew up in a very good family, had very good education. I felt as if I could do anything I wanted to do in terms of choosing a career or training. You know, it was open to me. I had job opportunities, good friends. And yet there was this deep sense of a feeling of bondage, restriction. And I was living in the suburbs of Sydney. And I remember quite strongly one Saturday or Sunday on a weekend, and I could hear all around me the all the lawnmowers mowing the lawns of the quarter-acre blocks. And in the distance I could hear the whistles in the football field. All these signs of suburban life, kind of quite, well-off suburban life. The leisure of being able to play football, mowing your lawns, the nice house, the family, the car, the kids. Everything seemed quite nice. And yet, internally, I experienced a sense of urgency, great urgency. It said, get out of here. This is a trap. Which was strange to me at the time. I mean, I knew I wasn't going to be one who did that, in terms of I didn't want to actually get the house, the 2 cars, and the kids. I studied art, and I definitely needed a broader scope to explore the world. I wanted to explore the world. I wanted to know the ultimate truth. At that time, I hadn't met the Buddha Dharma. I was brought up as a Catholic. Although I resonated with some teachings of Jesus Christ, had a very soft place in my heart for Christ as someone, I think as a child, whom I felt was a friend, someone trustworthy, even though he wasn't present. But the qualities he displayed as a historical being was something that I was drawn towards: love, humility, compassion, non-harm, this kind of non-violence, and a great, deep, sincere commitment to his path and his understanding of truth. So that all resonated. But everything else about the church and the practices, to me, were quite empty in the mundane sense, spoke more to me of boundaries and limitations than freedom, and answered none of my questions, the arising questions which were about existence and metaphysical questions. I was not allowed to ask, particularly in that environment. When I finally met the Buddha's teaching some years later, I was greatly relieved to find a teaching that allowed me to question, to ask all of my questions, and inquire, and in fact encouraged me to inquire more and more deeply into my own experience, into my experience of the world, because that would lead one to truth. And the little insights I'd gathered along the way on my own search were verified when I heard the Buddha's teaching, particularly around the teaching of anicca. All things are impermanent. All things that come into existence must pass away. They're all in flux and flow. Nothing stays the same. This was a truth I'd begun to understand in my own investigations through art as one sits and observes a landscape, for example, or observes one's internal mind, mental processes in order to know what to paint. It's a shifting landscape, internally and externally. And as one focuses more inwardly, you start to see that shifting landscape more clearly. And it reflects externally. I would be looking externally and see these colours aren't staying the same, they're shifting all the time. These trees aren't trees, they're shapes and shadows that are coming forward and disappearing. So, the more one looked and investigated, the world began to change shape, or rather, my perception of the world began to open up. The world is always as it is, but our perception of it, the way we learn to see it, is what fixes it, is what concretizes it. And that's the kind of prison we get caught in. And this is learned thinking. So in a way, with Buddha Dharma, the way of practice of meditation and cultivating wisdom and wholesome living, we have to undo a lot of the things that have been done to us in terms of conditioning our minds to see in certain ways, labeling things in a way that we actually don't experience them. We just call it, this is a tree, and then mind and eye is shut down. Oh, we know it's a tree, that's it. But do you really know what a tree is? When you really move towards that thing and begin to open your senses again and ask, what is this thing called or labelled a tree? Begin to come into an inquiry, a direct inquiry into the relationship of this phenomena. And then we start to understand something more about nature of the external world, which is similarly reflecting nature of the internal world, the processes of this mind and body. The nature of ignorance that prevents us from seeing the truth of the way things are, that prevents us from knowing what it is to not suffer, to not be caught in a realm of suffering. Now also, when I was waking up to some of these truths as a youngster, as I'm sure many of you, particularly those who haven't grown up with Buddhism, would have experienced in growing up, a lot of angst, just a lot of emotional turmoil as we're brought into this world and expected to find our orientation within it, expected to just accept the values around us, expected to find a kind of gratification and a sense of contentment with that, or that it's supposed to make us happy. But many of us realize it doesn't make us happy at all. And sometimes, in some cases, makes us more confused. The world, the advertising, the media is telling us one thing. We're being affected by that, but actually our hearts might be telling us another thing. So it's really important for us as spiritual beings to learn to listen to the heart in terms of what really brings suffering, what is really the cause of suffering, and what is really the cause of happiness. To know truly, not just to believe what's being conditioned in this culture. Because as I was a young person trying to come to terms with this world and my place in it, and how I could live this life in the best way possible, there was a lot of emotional angst, a lot of confusion, a lot of pain emotionally, which I didn't understand. I didn't know why it was there. I just knew it was painful. And it wasn't something that I could easily talk about with others either, because on the outside my life looked pretty good enough. What's the problem? But this suffering, this experience of suffering was so important to me because it was the most effective thing in my life. I began to pay attention to it. I made that the center of my life. And that's somehow how I came around to the search for truth and the search of Buddhism, is because I wanted to know, I wanted to understand what this suffering was. I knew I could not live my life unless I understood. I could not live my life in peace unless I understood this experience of suffering. Yes, one could say it was created from just seeing the pain around me in the world. The pain of beings caught in greed, hatred and delusion, and what that does to us, how that causes us to behave. All the killings and slayings and abuse in the world. And then just living in a city, watching people run around like ants around an anthill, not really going anywhere but busy, 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 very stressed, and suffering from all sorts of stress. But do they know what they're doing? Do they know what they're caught in? This kind of reflection. And just seeing myself, my own cravings for sense pleasure or for many different kinds of things, just recognizing there's the pain in that, the pain of not getting what one wants, or even the pain of getting what one wants when it turns out to be not the thing that actually satisfies that desire. So this experience of suffering became primary, and that what had arisen in my heart through the process of art was that I wanted to express, I wanted to know the ultimate truth. That's what I was trying to express in my art. But of course I had to find it before I could express it. So that pretty much set me off on a journey to see the rest of the world and just take it all in, see where we were going. So I travelled for a little under a year through Southeast Asia, India and Europe, with the intention to stay in England for a time, do some work and carry on. But by the time I got to England, there'd been a big shift. There'd been lots of contemplation throughout that period of travelling and moving on, just a backpack on your back and moving on day to day. And what I'd realised is that actually suffering was the same everywhere. Not only my own, but everyone else's, no matter what culture I was in, no matter what side of town I was on, the wealthy side or the poor side, suffering was the same everywhere. And no culture seemed to have a better handle on it than any other. Everyone seemed to be just as ignorant about it than anyone else. So when I got to England, there was a big turning inwards. And I realised actually, having soaked up all of that, I have to come inwards now. The answers are not out there. And so the inquiry just naturally turned inwards, and I wanted to learn how to meditate. And synchronistic events occurred that led me to a Burmese teacher who was teaching meditation, who then advised me to go to Amaravati Monastery, where after a year, of course, I eventually decided to take ordination. But that year was a powerful year. I was able to stop working and spend a year doing some meditation retreats, inquiring into the teaching. The first retreat I went on, which actually convinced me of this path, was the first time I went to Amaravati, a 10-day meditation retreat. And it was upon hearing the teachings of the Four Noble Truths that I actually felt deep relief in my heart. The Four Noble Truths, as some of you might know, not everyone here, the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. This is just the nutshell of the Four Noble Truths. And what brought me great relief was talking about the truth of suffering, or hearing teachings on the truth of suffering, such that I realized the suffering that you've been experiencing, that you've been churning with, that's been causing so much distress. It's just the truth of suffering. It's not yours, it's not your fault even. This is the experience of beings caught in a realm where there's ignorance, greed, hatred and delusion. Just to be able to hear that much, there was a turning around, because that suffering that I was experiencing, and as many of you might know, becomes so personalized. This is my suffering, something that I have to do about it, or something I'm getting wrong, and if I get it right, I won't have to suffer if I find the right partner, or get enough money to buy the house, the SUV, the whatever, or get the right whatever. But it puts so much pressure on the personal level. And on the personal level, there's a lot of confusion because I don't know the right way. But to hear that there is dukkha, there is this suffering, this an experience of all beings caught in samsara, not only human beings. That was a great relief. In conjunction with the fact that this suffering we experience has a cause. And once we understand that cause and undermine that cause, we can experience the cessation of suffering completely. And that the path, the truth, the fourth truth of the path was just guidance on how to cultivate the path in order to realize complete cessation of suffering. So not only did it relieve me of this very personalized focus on suffering as being me and my problem, it offered the experience of the cessation of suffering through the development of a way of practice, of inquiry, and that I would taste that experience of the ending of suffering myself. I didn't have to believe that it was going to happen one day. I didn't have to have faith in it. I just had to continue my inquiry, following up on my understanding of the practice until these truths became more apparent. The teaching on the Four Noble Truths is the teaching that the Buddha first gave to the 5 disciples in Sarnath, near modern-day Varanasi or Benares, a couple of months after his original awakening. By that time, he had understood within himself how he should talk about what he'd realized. Under the Bodhi tree, he realized enlightenment, but spent several weeks afterwards just contemplating by himself around that Bodhi tree, contemplating different aspects of what he'd understood, so that he could begin to teach it to beings in a skillful way, hoping that they too then would be able to come to understand that way to the cessation of suffering. And essentially, there's many different ways we can talk about this teaching, depending on the time you have. But also the Buddha was able, such a wise being, was able to give just the right teaching to beings he met, because he could see quite clearly where they were caught, where each of us were caught in our own little pockets of delusion, if you like. And the Buddha was able to see the ripeness of a being for realizing the truth and being able to tell them something that would just help undo a certain fixed perception to allow a new understanding to arise and thus liberate them. So there are many, many different ways of teachings we find in the Tripitaka, the canon, the teachings of the Buddha that have been passed down to us. One of my most favorite and most pithy sayings carries a lot of meaning. When the Buddha was asked, how would you sum up your teaching? How would you sum it up in the shortest way? And he said, nothing whatsoever is worth clinging to. Nothing whatsoever is worth clinging to. So this is an interesting teaching to begin to reflect upon, to let that in your heart and consider, what does that really mean? Because basically what he said when we're talking about causes and effects, that the cause of suffering is what he called tanha in Pali, craving or thirst, which manifests in different ways. Thirst for sensual experience, thirst for being, and thirst for non-being. Now they sound pretty abstract and a bit difficult to get a hold of, but I just want to put that in there right now, that the cause of suffering is this craving we experience. And according to his teachings, when the causes of something are removed, then the result can no longer appear. So with the removal of this craving, then suffering ceases, or suffering no longer arises. Right? It's as simple as that, really. And that's really talking about the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, this craving, thirsting. And the cessation of suffering, the third noble truth, it's when that craving is completely abandoned. We may experience cessation of suffering momentarily when a certain particular craving is abandoned. But when that motion, that movement of craving in the heart is completely abandoned, then suffering can no longer arise. Now the cause of craving, he elucidated a whole causal chain of events that leads to suffering, but with the undoing of those events, then suffering can no longer arise. Now this is a very profound insight, the insight that brought him to complete enlightenment on that night under the Bodhi tree. And it's summed up in the Four Noble Truths. But what I want to point out here is that even though he says craving is the cause of suffering, actually at the root cause of craving, the first link on the causal chain to suffering is called ignorance. In Pali, avijja. It means not knowing. Not knowing. And in particular, not knowing the Four Noble Truths, not awakening to the Four Noble Truths, but in particular, not knowing. Now, when there's vijja, knowing, when there's that kind of knowing, that is the cessation of ignorance, there is no longer any suffering. Suffering cannot arise, because the cause of suffering is this ignorance and craving. With the removal of craving and ignorance, there is no longer any suffering. Now, there's many things, as I'm saying this, that this is touching on in terms of, yes, all the causes of suffering are within, conditioned in the mind. We often think causes of suffering out there. The leaders of the government. I won't list all the countries that we could call the leaders the cause of suffering at the moment, but we all know what I mean. Or even the person I'm living with. It's the cause of my suffering. That's why monastic life is very useful, because we have to live with lots of people. And we come to see them as our teachers. If we think they're causing us suffering, rather they're bodhisattvas helping us to wake up to the truth of suffering. Because the truth of suffering is within. But the truth of the cessation of suffering is also within us. So this is where we need to look. We have to start to look within at the workings of this body and mind. So, in accordance with this, the Buddha actually said, the world, in this body and in this fathom-long body, together with mind and perception, is the world. Is the arising of the world, the cessation of the world, and the path leading to the cessation of the world. In this fathom-long body, together with mind and perception. And then he said, the world in the Blessed One's dispensation is that which perceives the world and then conceives its conceits of the world. That is the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind as a sixth sense base. This is where we experience the world. In our delusion, believing ourselves to be separate beings, we very much experience ourselves as, I'm here in this skin bag and everyone else is outside of me and the world is out there. In the Buddha's dispensation, in order to realize truth, you need a reorientation. You need to understand how the world arises and ceases at these sense doors. Now, we're not going into a metaphysical debate about if something really exists over there, if my eyes are open or closed or not. It's actually just encouraging you to experience in your own direct experience, where do visual things happen? Where do sounds happen? Where do tastes happen? Where do tactile sensations happen? Where do thoughts, feelings, memories happen? They're all dependent on this body-mind. And this is where our experience of the world arises, is conditioned, and persists. And this is where we get trapped as egoic beings in this mentally constructed world. So in order to begin to undo that, to see the truth, we start to examine, we start to inquire into our own experience of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, feeling, knowing. Now this works extremely well for realization because you're bringing your attention to one place, the place where it's actually happening. If we want realization, realization comes in a way that we taste it and know it directly for ourselves. Even if the Buddha were here today and declared suffering and the cessation of suffering, told you about that truth, it doesn't wake you up. Even if you really believe him, even if you have complete faith in him and bow down and say, yes, that's it. If you haven't seen it in your own heart, you are not free. So this is why every aspect of his teaching is pointing to us to look within our own hearts, within our own experience of this body-mind and inquire into, yes, what is the world? What is myself? And this is a fascinating inquiry. And he uses this to begin to start to discern where the causes of suffering arise and where they cease. So we can start to get a handle on this pattern of suffering arising and ceasing and tasting for ourselves till it becomes second knowledge, second nature, to know when grasping and craving is present and to know how to let go and to taste the suffering when it's present and to taste the cessation of suffering when we let go. This is very, very important. Because one aspect of the importance of that is that when people hear, and in my experience in teaching and learning this practice, when people hear that craving is the cause of suffering and we need to let go of craving, they find it incredibly difficult to take that on board because they think, I'm going to lose everything I've ever wanted. Is that a feeling you get sometimes when you hear about this? I'm going to lose, and then what will be left? Surely there won't be any happiness left if I can't hang on to these things. And does that mean I have to let go of my loved ones? Does it mean I have to shave my head, put on robes? It doesn't mean any of that necessarily. At some point it might appear that that is a way forward for you. But to inquire into your own experience of craving is to understand what it really means. It's a movement, it's a conditioned movement in the mind that moves with wanting and not wanting upon the experience of pleasure and pain. But it's an habitual movement. We don't do it with this knowledge. We don't do it with vidya, with knowing, with understanding. It's habitual and unconscious, therefore we're not waking up to the truth of suffering. Therefore we're not in a position to understand the truth of cessation of suffering. Now in our own experience, when we can come to witness and experience the truth of suffering, where craving is clinging to something, we have to understand how letting go happens. Letting go doesn't happen by getting rid of the object of clinging or destroying the thing that's clinging. Letting go of clinging and craving happens through understanding that this is painful. As if you're holding a burning hot coal and you've been holding it for centuries because you've been taught that's what you're supposed to do, but you're experiencing pain all over, and you know you're experiencing pain and you don't know how to get rid of this pain because you haven't related it to the fact that you're holding a burning hot coal. So this inner inquiry is coming to the point where we can see, oh, it's just that much. There's this hot coal and my hand's wrapped around it. That's the kind of comprehension that comes when you see directly for yourself. And when that comprehension arises, there's a natural letting go. When you notice grasping here is painful, what happens is we drop it because we've figured out where it's coming from. It's very pragmatic in that sense. Oh, I've seen it. How stupid, why didn't I see that before? Because no one had ever shown us. We thought it was normal, we've always acted this way, and it's been in ignorance, it's been hidden. This is the power of ignorance. It veils us to so many inner processes we don't think we have control over. How often do we experience ourselves as victims of this world? Someone's causing me suffering, rather than seeing, perhaps it's the way I'm relating to this experience that is causing me dukkha. So if we can begin to look at how am I relating to this experience, begin to discern through the powers of meditation, we're developing mindfulness, concentration, discernment, so we can actually, these tools are mental tools which gather power, and we can start to look, we can start to gain a facility to contemplate inwardly throughout this body and mind to see these truths of suffering, cessation of suffering, and thus walk the path of relinquishing suffering when it arises, developing the wholesome and developing the states that allow us stillness, clarity, wisdom, compassion in order to advance this path for the benefit of ourselves and others. And when you taste that freedom, it's the deepest sweetness, the deepest pleasure, the highest happiness, the Buddha called it. And when you taste it, you realize that's what you've been looking for all your life. And when there is that experience, the experience of being dependent on material things for pleasure no longer arises, because you've understood and seen the relative value of that. And you don't have to throw it away, you don't have to tell others it's evil. You just know how to relate to it in a way that no longer causes suffering. If it's useful in your life, you use it. If it's not, you abandon it. So a great emphasis in the Buddha's teaching on direct and personal experience for wisdom to arise in the heart. Any intellectual knowledge can be corrupted, even if we have a perfect intellectual knowledge of the teaching on suffering and the end of suffering, the path to liberation. If we do not have the wisdom from direct experience arising in our own heart, then that knowledge is corruptible. Our behavior, our actions of greed, hatred, and of body, speech and mind are still corruptible by greed, hatred and delusion. So direct knowing for ourselves, and we can start with that immediately, every moment, day by day, developing the factors of the path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. In brief, they're called wholesome living, meditation, and wise reflection or wisdom. And these things are working together all the time to develop the path. Gradually insight arises and frees us by degrees from certain kinds of suffering. And then we gain the strength and the wisdom to take the path to its fullest extent and free us completely from the power of ignorance.